Welcome to the channel Drive. This video is a part of our AMA series. In this episode, we are having Alan Richardson talking on the topic testing and automation in testing.
So my name is Alan Richardson. You can find me at EvoTester.com. There's been a bunch of questions that I saw come in through the Facebook forum. So people are joining now. I can see that. So the etiquette around this, I'm not sure about, because I think we've passed the time when we're supposed to start. So I'm just going to start. And everyone else can catch up. So I'll try and say everything that is irrelevant at this point in time. And if there's any new questions, I'll see hopefully comments in this forum, or Mahesh can instant message me because I've got Twitter there so I can see their messages. So the aim for this is to answer as many questions as I can on topics that people are interested in and people are putting forward. Live can work well if there's engagement, but there's so many questions there, I'm just going to work through them and start that way. Okay, so I'm assuming comments is real time and video is buffered. If you do get issues with the video, just stick it on pause for a little while. Hopefully it'll creep up because the broadband in the UK is not good, or at least where I live. So one of the interesting things that came through from all the questions is there's a lot of focus on automating. And just in general, automating can be hard simply because it requires a huge amount of experience to do well, right? That's why people fail with automated execution when they're doing programmatic execution through programming languages, because you do need a lot of experience with programming and design and testing and general automated work. But you don't have to just use programming tools in order to automate. There's a lot of codeless type testing tools, free keyword driven type testing tools. Now there's an art to those as well, right? Because there's a modeling art, and automating in general is not an easy thing to do. So we'll hopefully cover some of those questions as we come through. But the main point is always, what I kind of stress with my work is, as much as possible, taking responsibility for not just what you do, but how you do it and how you say it and how you think about it, because those are absolutely essential. Right, you will. I guarantee you will make mistakes when you're testing, when you're automating, when you're doing any of this. That will happen because that is how we learn. One of the issues that we face is very often we jump to strategic automating far too quickly when we really want to be as tactical as possible, as early as possible in order to learn. Okay, so I'm going to start looking through some of these questions. If you have any questions that were not originally posted in the original post, then do add them in the comments, right? Because I've copied out the questions that were in the previous post because I don't want to have too much stuff running to mess with the live feed. And if the live feed goes wrong, there's going to be multiple recordings, so we'll get one at least uploaded well. So one of the first questions that I saw was, what pointers do you consider when choosing an automating tool or building an automation framework? Most organizations simply follow the trend blindly, choosing Selenium and hybrid frameworks. What is your opinion? So I have multiple opinions on this, but one of the things that I say and I generally stress is don't build automation frameworks. There's a difference between a framework and a library, and we want to get to the point where we're building libraries rather than frameworks. The way that I make the distinction is that a framework controls what I do. A library is something that I can use and plug into however I use the tools that I'm working with. So Selenium WebDriver is a library. I can plug it in, I can use it. It doesn't really matter how I write my code. WebDriver doesn't care. It doesn't matter what language I'm writing it in. There's multiple implementations in different libraries. JUnit is a framework. In order for JUnit to run, I have to annotate my test code with that test, and then JUnit picks it out and decides what it's going to run. I have to conform to the JUnit standards in order to have my code working. So when people talk about frameworks, I get a little bit nervous that they're writing something that will control what I do. And there's so many sites that I've been on that have given me a framework that is there to help me that I've had to bypass in order to actually do the work I'm supposed to do. Right, so I had to learn reflection in order to actually bypass the frameworks and get work done. So, and also the word hybrid. I looked up hybrid testing on Wikipedia before I started this, and it's got one of the worst definitions I've ever seen online. It's quite confusing. It's not a term that I use, simply because I know that people think in terms of keyword-driven testing, data-driven testing, model-driven testing, whatever other type of testing. When we're automating, what we're essentially doing is taking paths through an application and automating the execution of those. Paths require data. So in a sense, everything is data-driven. Sometimes the data is encoded in the path, because in order to go through a particular path, you need invariant data. I will only go down this particular path if the customer is male. I go down this path if the customer is female. So that's an invariant on that path, a data invariant. We never change that value. If we do, we go down a different path and we're doing essentially a different execution. So with any automated execution, we have concepts of it is a model and the path is encoded in there. We may not have identified a general model in advance. It is data driven because the data controls the path. Then what we have is variant data over the top. When people are doing data-driven testing, what makes me a bit nervous is that everything is controlled by the data. So I would have a data line that has the gender, but the gender controls a path. So then we've got data that is actually controlling a path. And then we get confused because we're putting in too much data. I think one of the keys with data-driven testing is to minimize as much data as possible. So we're only seeing the important data in the test, the variant data that is making a difference, because there's invariant data encoded in the path. Keyword-driven testing is just an abstraction layer for making our code readable. And so we have verbs and nouns that make things readable. And hybrid essentially means, well, we're taking bits of all of this. And it almost sounds like it's not as good as any of the others because it's hybrid. It's not clean. Whereas in fact, most of the automated execution that we do will be hybrid, right? Because if we're using Selenium or WebDriver, that on its own will not be good enough to make maintainable code because we need an abstraction there. Is our abstraction there going to be keyword driven? Is it going to be model based? Is it a domain specific language that we put on top? Are we going to put data through this? Is it going to be variant data? It's always completely hybrid, right? Because the art is in building abstraction layers that help us with our work. And that can be hard, right? The reason that automating is hard and is different than like building an application is that application developers build different abstraction layers, right? Testers build, or test automation requires abstraction layers that make it easier to read. Whereas with application code, that's less important. You don't build an abstraction there to make it easy to read because you're writing something that is very specific, whereas we're writing something that's very generic, so it needs to be easy to read. That's why keyword-driven might help, but then keyword-driven imposes a whole bunch of extra tools that we need on top. So everything is hybrid. What we really want are base tools and libraries that are effective for the technology that we're using. Right, so we use Selenium if we're testing web typically, or Rest Assured for API. And we combine multiple tools and libraries to help us test at different layers. So very often people are picking Selenium because it is the most popular, it is robust, and it is now a standard, which makes it a default choice. Commercial tools that automate web applications under the covers use Selenium WebDriver, so it's a fairly good choice. But what we do when we're automating is we look at our skill sets, our budget, because when people are considering what we've got to do, we have to look at the budget. And the budget isn't just how much it costs to build a tool, it's can we afford staff with the experience to do this? Sometimes a commercial tool can be cheaper than an open source tool because we might be able to train up people that don't have programming experience to use a commercial tool. We may find it hard to get people, employ them who have experience in that commercial tool in the first place. We may have to recruit potentially very expensive people to use an open source code-based tool if we don't have that in our environment. So budget is a fairly big constraint. And how do we decide on budget? Well, what we do is we look at what is it worth to us if the thing that we automate is automated. So thanks for that comment, Siam. I'm glad that you found the book useful. Good to see. I'm going to try and respond to comments as well. And if you leave questions in there, we'll answer those. When we're trying to decide how we're going to automate and what tools we're going to use, we have to look at what experience do we currently have, right? Because very often we haven't got the experience required to do strategic automating. I make a distinction between tactical and strategic automating, and I'll try and cover that over the course of this. Because if we approach things tactically, it's can I do something fast and now that gets a job done that helps me? And it might be just me doing it. Strategic is what is best for this project? What is best for our company? What are we going to standardize and roll out? What are we going to maintain longer term? And clearly, it requires much more experience to build something strategic that is going to last longer term than it is to knock up some code that we're going to use tactically. And a combination of both of those is useful. What flexibility do we have in terms of choosing what tools we're going to use? Because things may be imposed on us, we might not have a choice. Someone may have written a framework that we have to use because someone pitched that as part of the job. So we have to use this keyword-driven framework because we believe that gave us an edge in the pitch process for the work. We also have to consider risks, not just risks in the application that we're testing, but in the tool that we are using. Right, because every tool has some risks. Can we continue to afford paying for this commercial tool, or are we tied into it? Is the tool cheap enough that it works fine? Do we have the skill set for the open source? Can we maintain it? Can we fix bugs if they happen? There are going to be risks in the tool themselves. We also have to consider how easy is it to adopt the tool? How easy is it to evaluate it? How effective does it work with the technology? Does the tool try and take over everything? Or have we got specific libraries for specific technologies? There's a lot of things that we have to work out. We also have to figure out what is it that we actually want to try and achieve with the automated execution. And a lot of people are not in the position to answer these questions because they don't have the experience. It took me a long time to be able to answer these questions effectively because we were learning as we went along. And when you're in that situation, generally you'll make the same mistakes as everyone else. Like we'll automate poorly, we'll write bad code, we won't put any abstractions in place, and people will be untrained, they'll be inexperienced, like there's a whole bunch of things. And under those circumstances, people very often want to cut costs. But the reality is, the easiest way to succeed and to succeed quickly is to hire someone who has already done that. And making sure, even if it's just for a short period of time, to help you get over the hurdle. Because the hard part is finding someone also without bias. Because when we try and look at who can help us, there'll be consultancy companies out there, they'll be biased in terms of continuing to sell as consultancy, or the person that wants to do the job may be biased in terms of the programming language that they know how to use rather than other programming languages. And that might lead you into a different direction. Ideally, we want the choice of things to be a team choice, right? So not just a test team choice, but working with the programmers so that they can contribute and help out. Now, we have a difficulty sometimes that testing can be outsourced to somewhere else. So very often the test automation is done by a completely different team than the development team. Under those circumstances, it's hard to learn from each other's experience, cross-pollinate with knowledge. But if you're working on the same team as programmers, involve them in that decision, because it really helps, because they have the programming experience. They can look at how easy is it to deploy, how easy it to develop in. But you don't rely on them to have the modeling experience to give you the information that you need in order to model automated execution for testing purposes. Okay, other question. How best can we go about automating any IoT device? Suppose we want to perform automated testing for Fitband or Apple Watch. Now, this is interesting in the sense that it shouldn't really matter what we're trying to test, right? Because ideally, we want to unit test the code, and we want those unit tests to be running off the device. After that point, it becomes a series of integration risks that we're addressing. And it's the same with any application. We unit test it as much as possible in isolation. Then it's integrating either the different units or the different modules, or putting it on an operating system. How does it interact with the device libraries? How does it interact with different versions of the devices? How do we upgrade between versions? We also have to look at how much can we get away with by automating at just normal technology tiers. So we don't want our first choice to be automating at the Fitband or Apple Watch level. How much can we get away by automating on the actual device? Right? Could we build a self-testing application version that when we install it on the device, it runs, does as much as it can, and reports back, writes a log, or communicates over HTTP? Could we do that? Do we have to do it as automated through the GUI? Because then we're testing it at one layer. We want to go as many layers down as possible. How much can we automate with just plain HTTP messaging? Because then the tool set can be just a library that makes HTTP requests. Because anything outside the normal technology tiers is, we have to then think, well, what tool actually works on this device? What risks are we attempting to find the presence of or detect? What experience do we have automating this device? The more we narrow it down to a device focus, the more specific it gets and the harder it actually gets. And we're the more tool reliant. So the kind of best way to automate it is to architect the application and build it so that it has as few device-specific risks as possible. And that is not how people build these applications, unfortunately. But if we can do that, it's very easy to test in continuous integration, and then we just have a tiny set of risks to actually deal with. So unfortunately, a lot of these questions are beyond a test team responsibility. Very often we find ourselves in a situation where we're given something and told to automate it, when reality is we should be given something and told to test it, and then we look at, well, what testing has been done previously, then we look at what extra risks, and then we test it. And then within our testing sphere, we look at what is appropriate for us to automate. But unfortunately, that's not often how the world works, and we're just told, here's a thing, automate it. And we have to automate it from the outside in, and that is not the most appropriate way to do it. Which is why working with teams is very important, working closely with the programming teams to get the whole architecture and build process working. Okay, Edgy asks, everyone claims to automate, everyone claims to get value out of automation, and very few share failure stories. Has anyone written a book on automation failures and mistakes? So I think there are a few. I haven't read many of them. The only ones I've read are Dot Graham and Mark Fuster's books, and they're relatively old now. The problem is, a lot of the failure stories are, we tried to do all this automated execution work and we didn't actually know what we were doing, right? We didn't know how to do it. We've never done this before, but here are the lessons we learned. But then when you gain experience and you look at the lessons or you look at the problems and you go, that's not actually good advice or that's too generic to actually be helpful. Because the hard part is that we really need experience in order to evaluate mistakes. and the lessons and the recommendations. It's the same with best practices and design principles. Now, one of the early questions is people just jump to Selenium WebDriver because they don't have the experience to know how to evaluate different tools. So you pick the tools that people are using that seem appropriate because we just don't have anyone that knows how to do it. And if we don't know how to do the evaluation, then we have to justify our choices in terms of, well, keyword-driven testing is better than X because anyone can do it and the tools are free. But the problem is we don't necessarily have the experience to evaluate when we're doing keyword-driven testing poorly and how to spot the mistakes in keyword-driven testing and how to bypass those. So the best thing we can do is constantly explore options. And we don't necessarily need to commit to an option early, right? Very often we're too quick to jump to strategic long-term automating. Very often if we explore things tactically, then we can experiment and we can project forward whether we think this will scale, whether we have the experience to build this long term, whether this will cause us issues going forward, right? A lot of tactical small experiments is much easier and better to handle than committing long term to a big strategic item. Okay, what areas do you suggest to automate in a tester's day-to-day activities? So this also comes down to the hard part with this is you want to be able to tell people these are the things we should automate. But in order to automate, we have to go, well, what skill sets do we have? What things are we doing that we believe could be automated? What things are we doing that we even know we could automate, right? Because if you don't have a lot of experience, you don't know what the possibilities are. And also you've got to consider, well, what do we actually want to learn, right? Because we have to keep an eye on our career prospects, the technologies, make sure that we're moving forward. And how can I apply the learning into my work? All of these things together. But when it comes to what should we automate, start tactically, right? What can we automate quickly? What can we automate easily? What can I actually do for myself rather than have someone else automate for me? Because strategically it's, well, what will help the team? What will help the project? One of the mistakes that I think the industry has done with the kind of software development engineering test role is have someone whose job it is to automate on behalf of someone else, or have someone whose job it is to create tools for other people, right? That gives someone a fun job, but then they have to continue to justify that job by adding new features and building frameworks and completely expanding it. Whereas people over here need to do work. And giving them the skills to do the work and the time and to automate it and help them choose tools is a much better approach than having someone give people things. So the easiest way for me to answer the question, what areas do we suggest to automate, is when I was starting to automate, some of the first things that I did was writing test scripts. So we were doing manual testing, which was all scripted. So I automated the writing of the manual test scripts by creating a diagrammatic model, feeding it into my tool, and my tool wrote out test scripts that we could then follow. Creating cross-references between things in the tool. A lot of my initial automating was automating the tools we were using to control the testing because they had such bad graphical user interfaces. Raising defects from text files, so I didn't have to spend the time going through all the hoops in the tool. I just wrote a text file, it uploaded it in the tool and put all the fields in. Creating test data was a very useful thing to do. Setting up the environments and loading the test data in. After having done testing, collating results off the system and automatically uploading it into the application so that they were there in the test execution logs. Parsing log files, looking for errors. As I got more experienced and better at programming, I wrote tools to take the XSLT transformation specs that we were using and check that they actually worked by using sample data. But all the time I was constrained by the time that I had, the budget, which was usually nothing, the tools that I had available, and very often we had locked down environments, so we had no tools. So a lot of it was, how can I learn how to use Visual Basic for applications in Excel to automate these things. The skill sets that I had, because I knew how to program, but I didn't necessarily know how to do certain things, so I had to learn. And what I could get away with in the process, right? Because we've all got management edicts that we have to do. So I think it's start tactical, start small, look for kind of 80-20, like what big wins can we get for like a small amount of work, achieve the maximum impact. A mistake that people make is going strategic too big. So when we're looking at what can we automate, well, we could build a framework that will help us do this, and then we can all contribute. That's strategic before we've actually learned how to automate tactically and small. So do tactical quick wins, just try and improve your daily life. Question on tools and tips for creating brilliant videos like the ones in the courses and that I put on YouTube. So things like this where I'm doing green screen. So I have a list of technologies. I'll try and paste them in here. In fact, I'll paste them in as a comment here. So I use Camtasia, which is the screen capture tool, a webcam, an iRig USB mic, a pop-up green screen. This is a pop-up. It's a little thing on the floor. I pop it up. I could take that down, but all the magic would go away. 2 LED lights and on boom poles, but I didn't start with any of this, right? I started with like clumsy, horrible green screens that were very cheap. In fact, I started with no green screens and just gradually built up. The inbuilt webcams in the laptop that weren't very good. The inbuilt mic in the laptop that again isn't very good. Start with free software, and the most important thing is to have as good a microphone as you can afford and just create content. I'm streaming this through free software called OBS. OBS can do green screens very well, even with just a white background. And this can record screens, it can record video, can live stream at Facebook. So OBS is very good. There's lots and lots of free tools. The hardest part is editing, finding a decent video editor. So the reason I use Camtasia is that everything is in one bit of software, but it is expensive. But I had to build up the funds to do that. And I knew at that point that I was going to do a lot of videos, so it was a lot easier to justify. But there are a lot of free tools, so just it's start. Don't even worry about the quality. So long as the audio is good enough, people will put up with pretty much anything. Alan, can you mention some important mandated QA processes that every testing team should follow? So I think the most important thing is to have reviews, right? So when you do some work, someone else reviews it and says, well, did you think about this? Did you consider this? We could improve this. Even in what you've written, you could write it this way differently. Could we use this tool? What did you learn? Can you go and explain what you learned to somewhere else? Because the most important thing we have to do is continue to improve. And the only way that we can continue to improve is through feedback. And a lot of time we rely on external feedback and other people telling us what to do. But we have to get in the habit of, as individuals and as teams and as companies, taking responsibility for our own growth. And so the easiest way to do that is reviews, and you can do that yourself. So if you just periodically look back on the work that you have done and go, if I was giving advice to someone else, how could they improve this? And you give that kind of advice to yourself. So I think reviews and retrospectives, debriefs, that feedback process is the most important thing, because too often people are left isolated. People they're told to do one thing, they're not given any support. The management don't actually look after the team or help them improve. They're continually externally focused. That's what makes things fall apart. And that's when we leave organizations and go and try and find other teams. So keep learning, because everything that you need in your process will eventually appear there if you keep experimenting. If you drop things that are not adding value, drop things that are waste activities, you stop writing reports that people don't read, or at least cut down the size. So you're still creating the report, you're meeting the contract, but if no one's reading it, it's not adding value. Yeah, so AJ, it's OBS that I use for streaming this. One of the interesting things in terms of feedback is that what we don't often do is use people's skill sets effectively. So everyone wants to kind of over specialize too fast, particularly when it comes to automating. People want to over specialize on automating, when what we really want to do is get in the habit of using that feedback process to identify what people are really good at, help them do that, what people are not as good at, help them get better. But don't just make the people who are good at something be the only people that do that, because then they over specialize. Then it becomes a blocker if they leave or if they're not there for a day. So feedback to help us work out what we're all good at. So what does it mean by EvilTester? How did I get the tag EvilTester, and is there any special story behind it? So there's the reason I like EvilTester is that there's multiple things I could say. Right? There's multiple stories I could bring out for this. I could make myself look in different ways. But the simple thing is, a lot of people get hung up on words. And one of the things that I've tried to do for a long time is not have as much of an emotional reaction to words. Right? So when people say, I don't know, we're doing scripted testing, you don't go, that's a bad thing, because those are words, right? We're reacting to words. What we want to do is try and understand what that means, what people are actually doing. And a lot of time people go, evil, bad word, super bad. Whereas what I hear is alternative, right? Because projects need balance. And if all projects ever hear are the good stuff, the confirmatory feedback, that all the requirements are met, that this is good, this is working, then they'll miss all the warning signs and they won't improve. People don't speak up. They don't consider alternatives. I mean, it does stem back to when I started, because remember, I've got grey hairs, I've been doing this for a while, and it was very much waterfall projects, and it was very much testing was not a core part of the project. It was something you did afterwards. It was an extra. It was something people didn't see the need for, or if they did, it was a necessary evil. We were very often stuck in the basement or put in the windowless room at the back, or 20 people stuck on a tiny series of desks because it was less important. So that was testing. So, I mean, I embraced that notion that we were the kind of unwanted thing, and acted as a mirror, because I had nothing to lose. I could hold up a mirror to the project and be honest and point out the impact of decisions and the risks of the path that we were taking. And again, you're in the position of, you cannot think worse of me. I have nothing to lose at this point. I will embrace this. And so for me, it's kind of like, it means a balance. It means doing things that other people won't do, thinking about things in the way that people won't think about them, saying things that people won't say, having the courage to do that. It's an attitude that helps me test. So there's a really good book called Provocative Therapy by Frank Farrelly. Let me put that in the comments so people can see it. And this is a psychotherapy approach where it's kind of devil's advocate therapy. People are being told the things that they say internally in the head that they don't want to admit to. But the therapist has to conduct that with humor, right? Whenever you're giving people bad news in projects, you have to have some way of saying it so that they don't punch you in the face. You have to have some way of saying it with humor, or so that they know you're doing it for their best interests. And I think the only image in that book is a court jester, because the court jester was the only person that was allowed to say anything against the king. Everyone else had to say, yes, my liege, that is a good idea, let's do those things. The court jester was the person who was allowed to make a joke, sing a funny song that pointed out the possible bad things, the alternatives, the honest view. Like the shaman explores the kind of evil magical realms and protects their people from evil spirits and provides access to healing. It's that alternative path that other people won't go down, that are prepared to go down. but they need to exist alongside this good path of law and order that everyone else is on. Because if you don't have that, you don't have a balance. And that's what the whole EvilTester thing is for. And the little iconography came about because I was getting so annoyed on projects. I needed some way of venting my frustration. So I just drew little cartoons of things that were going bad. And then that kind of stuck. And it took me a couple of years to buy the domain name. I just couldn't believe no one had bought this. But I think people they don't like that that word, evil. So we have to change our heads so that we don't have such an emotional attachment to words. Question: how much scriptless automation tools will help in career growth? So this is interesting, right? Because scriptless automation is an important concept. And for the longest time, I didn't like the notion because I liked programming. I liked people programming and building up the skill sets to do that. But over time, it became aware to me that being able to code and code well for automated execution is hard, right? It is a very hard thing to do. But scriptless opens that up to people who don't necessarily like programming, won't read all the programming books, won't go back and read all the design books. And the reason it's hard, right, is we have to learn testing. We have to learn all the technology that we're testing to identify risks. Then if we say, right, we also need to code to do automated execution. And it's not just code, it's really well designed code. So you have to know all the design patterns, you have to know all the architectural risks, you have to know how to use the IDEs, you have to know how to do unit testing. There's a lot of skills being built in there. And that's what really makes it hard. So scriptless tools can help massively on that. The problem is that there are so many scriptless tools. There's no standard scriptless tool. So when you're at work and you're using scriptless tools, if you then go for another job and say, I've used scriptless tool X, this company you're going for might not be using scriptless tool X. So it's not necessarily the tool itself that helps your career growth. It's your ability to look at the transferable skills from that tool. Because these transferable skills we have to abstract into reusable domain-specific languages. Right? If you're using scriptless, it might be keyword-driven. You have to create keywords that map onto your domain. That's a modeling process, and that is a skill. Being able to write the right keywords or the right commands or the right level to make your automated execution maintainable and to survive long term. That's a skill. It's a modeling skill. Being able to identify the aim of automating. What are you trying to automate? Are you automating the correct things that are appropriate for the project at this point in time? That's a transferable skill. Modeling the system so that you can cover it effectively. That's a transferable skill. So scriptless automation tools help when you identify the transferable skills that are in there and have the ability to communicate that to people, right? And also identify the technical knowledge that you're having to build up. Because even if you're using scriptless tools, you're probably still having to identify locator strategies through XPath or CSS. You're still having to understand HTTP and headers in order to inject them into the system. All those technology learnings, they are transferable, and that's the benefit. The other benefit is it might actually help you do things that you weren't able to do, particularly if you're working on a tactical level, like things like a robot framework, completely free. You don't need anyone's permission. You bring it in, you learn some scriptless testing through keywords, you learn all those things, and it might tactically make a difference to your work if you can automate things that are important to you. So Mahesh is asking, how do I find Catalan Studio? I haven't used it. Catalan Studio, my impression of it is it looks like a big thing that has pooled in a lot of open source products and potentially has some layers of abstraction on top. But because I haven't used it, I can't really comment on it. See, the interesting thing is because I can code, I tend to bypass a lot of those tools when I'm doing work. And I often only get to see these tools if the company that makes them invites me to have a look at them, or I'm working with a client that is using them, and I've never worked with a client that's using Catalan Studio, so I haven't spent the time looking into it. But all of these tools, what's interesting is pretty much every tool works. Pretty much every tool can fit someone's needs if you can learn it. So it's about, is there a learning path that works for you into that tool? Because make no mistake, there is no such thing as the best tool or one tool that is better than other tools. They have risks, they have issues. We have to have the ability as individuals when we choose them to bypass that and absorb it, or as teams to do the same thing. Okay, basic question, but getting environment support during testing is still a challenge. What should be a QA team's approach? Getting support from anyone in work situations can be hard. The amount of times that we've had to try and get support from people and been told no. Right. The unfortunate thing is, this is also why I had to build up an attitude of being prepared to keep asking, being prepared to keep nagging, different communication strategies. And then the other thing that I found interesting is very often it was left to the people on the ground to get this done. So you're a tester, you're working on a project, you're trying to do your testing, you don't have access to environments to do certain things, you raise that to your manager, and they don't push it. So you have to keep pushing it. And that's what's interesting is we take that as a bad thing. What we're actually learning at that point are management skills. We're learning negotiation tactics. We're learning how we can sell things to people. And very often what happens is we give up, and we shouldn't give up. What we should do is keep pushing and develop those skills, because that's what strengthens us to go forward. Not what we want to hear, but that's true. So I think the key is, the way that I've approached this is I have to know what I want. Right? If I want access to the environment, I don't want access to the environment just because I want access. I want access to the environment because I specifically want to do these things. And I know that if I can specifically do these things, then I can achieve this. And I'm able to communicate what this is. And I know that if I don't get access to it, not only can I not do this, these things over here will happen. This is the impact of not being able to do it. Right? It has to be more than, I need access to the database so I can run SQL queries. It's, I need access to the database so I can run SQL queries so that I can test the results of this testing. Otherwise, I can't do it, and bugs might slip through, and I have to ask that team over there to do the queries for me, and that takes their time away. So I'm spending time asking them, they're spending time doing it. Whereas if we got access, we could cut that down into a couple of seconds after the test runs. Right? So we have to also be able to explain it in a way that people care. So some people that you're going to speak to are going to care about their time. And you're saying, I am spending your time on this and I want to spend my time. Management care in terms of project time, impact. It currently takes me 20 minutes. It could take me 3. If you can communicate it in terms that people understand. The other thing is making people feel the pain, right, of you not getting the support. So make lots of support requests to get the things that you want done. Don't compensate for it. Right? It's very tempting, because we all want to do good jobs, to do overtime to compensate for the length of time it takes us because we've got all these barriers. Don't do that. Don't absorb the pain. Make other people feel the pain by not doing the overtime. Because of that, saying, right, we'll have to do this tomorrow now because we don't have time to do that today. If we don't, it's a way of forcing empathy by making other people feel the pain of your situation. You've explained it to them, but you have to make them feel the pain. We have to communicate it in a way that they care about. The other thing, a lesson learned from studying evil, is temptation. Right, so what we do is we show people the alternative of how good it could be and how easy, but then bring them back and say, but this is what happens. Right, so we have to show them that alternative and make it very visceral so that they can feel it. Right, where's the next question? Okay, how can testers really know or figure out if they really belong to automation before they pick it up as a full-time thing, just because there's a buzz around? I see lots of people struggling to take the right call here. So the interesting thing for me is I do a lot of automating, right? But I also do a lot of testing, and I do security testing, and I go really deep technically when I test. So I don't really specialize. I know that what I find interesting is when people speak to me, some of them will think of me as that guy that does exploratory testing, or that guy that does technical testing, or that person that does automating. Whereas I do all of that, and I do management, and I've written applications, right? It's across the board. So in order to do that, I don't specialize in any specific things. What I specialize in is software development. So I have to go higher than the current set of roles that are on offer to me. So I think what we have to do is to learn how to test, and learn how to test as well as we can, right? Because people often think of test automating or automating in support of testing as a separate thing, and it isn't. It's augmenting our test strategy. Test automation is as part of our test strategy. We want to automate those things. If you don't have a good test strategy that's able to be understood, then the automating that you do will be wrong. So we need to know how to test and test well. Learn how to automate to support your testing, and that can be tactical. Learn bits and pieces. If people want to gravitate to more coding over time, then they need to concentrate on programming. So before committing to automation, they need to know how to program, and program well. And you should be able to bring that into your normal testing work as you're learning it. Right, when I was improving my programming, I was writing test data generation routines. I was writing little routines to use APIs to do work. The more that I learned here, the more that I could do here. So the way that you'll know if you belong is, as you are learning how to do it, can you feed it into your normal test work? If the answer is no, then what you're probably doing is not automating. It's not automating to support testing. It's probably just programming. And then it's not necessarily you should be doing into automation. You should probably go into programming. So automating is supporting the testing process. Because bear in mind, there are other things that we could learn. Right? As testers, we don't just have to learn how to automate. We could learn security testing. We could learn performance. The interesting thing is, as you're learning something, if you can fit it in to your testing, and if it's something that you enjoy learning about, then it's probably a good path. If it's not something, sorry, just hit the mic. If it's not something that you enjoy learning, it's probably not a good path. If it's not something, when you want to learn how to automate, you have to be prepared to read lots and lots of books on programming, lots and lots of books on design. Other things you could do is you could learn architecture, you could learn design. They will help you with your testing. Security will help you with your testing because you'll see other risks. Management skills will help you with your testing because you can communicate better. Web development, if you're working on web applications, will help you understand the risks of what you're doing. Programming, accessibility, marketing, SEO, diagramming, study skill, anything, right? If you can bring it back into your testing world, then it's a good thing to pursue. If, as you pursue it, you are interested and want to go beyond the things that are spoon-fed you, then it's a useful thing to bring in. But if you start doing automating but don't want to keep learning the topic, then it's probably not a good path, because you won't be able to pursue something well unless you enjoy it. And if you don't enjoy doing it or reading about it, you will never get good at it. And there's no point starting down something that you are going to impose a ceiling on, right? Find the right path for you as an individual. Don't over specialize too quickly because you see money in it, because the money changes. At the moment, automating might be well paid compared to something else, but something will come up, or the dynamics in the environment will change, and we will outsource the automating to a country that is cheaper, or other people that do it well, or a tool that will do it for us, or we'll bring in this AI stuff because we think it will be better, right? Things change. So focus on the paths that you enjoy, that give you the skill sets that you can apply, because then that will support you and take it earlier. Now, I'm never going to tell people not to learn how to code, right? Because I love coding. Coding was my first job. I write applications. I write lots of code. I automate lots of things. I automate lots of my marketing. I've just written a tool that automatically takes blog posts and creates videos, right? This is what I do. But I don't specialize because I see all of these skills, right? Testing, design, architecture, programming, management as part of being a software developer. And that's really what I aim for, and that's what I encourage people to do. Testing is a specialism within it, but if we don't have all these other skills, we can't fully contribute to the projects as well. How do you suggest to measure automation progress? As simply measuring the same based on the number of cases, because counting test cases doesn't guarantee that they will actually add value. So how do we measure progress with automation? So the interesting thing is, I don't measure a lot of stuff. What I might try and do is, if I'm in a management position, if we want to change something, I'll figure out how we can measure it so that we know that we've changed it for the better. But as soon as we've changed it for the better, that measurement goes away, because all I'm really trying to do is decide how we are improving. I rarely have to report on numbers. Now, this partly because I very often work in Agile projects, and the focus is on the sprint, what we're building in the sprint, and it's obvious if we're not building it effectively. But people lose sight of the amount of things that they don't do, all the things that they didn't automate as they were going through that they were supposed to in order to have the story done. And that's ultimately a problem around coverage. So if you want numbers, it never comes down to individual things. Because remember earlier on that I was talking about, we've got data-driven testing, model-based driven testing, keyword-driven testing, and really these are abstractions. When we automate, we are automating the execution of paths through a system. That path has data. So if we count test scripts, what we might be doing is counting paths through a system that are covered by different data. If it's data-driven testing, what is it we're actually counting at that point? Is it the variant data or the invariant data? The numbers get wrong. What we have to figure out is, are we covering the right things? And when we're assessing coverage, it's the data scope, the paths, the conditions, the requirements. They're probably more important to figure out than like numbers of test cases or scripts. So most of the time I don't actually measure. What we do is we review in terms of coverage. Are we doing too much in one area? Does the data going through this path actually make a difference? Right? Because if it's actually the same path with different data, but the data is part of an equivalence partition, they're the same thing. It didn't make any difference. So what we might want to do is drop some of them and then randomize some of the data within the equivalence partition. So it's a coverage question, and it's hard to really answer with a measurement if you don't have a model. What I have done in the past is, I remember working on a project and we were building an API, and I wasn't convinced that we had done enough. So I built a model of the API in terms of the verbs, in terms of the endpoints, in terms of the parameters, and all the automated execution we did, I put it through a proxy, I captured the HAR file, then I analyzed the HAR file against my model, and I found gaps. I found that there were certain endpoints that we hadn't hit. I found that there were certain verbs on certain endpoints that we had never used. So because I was comparing it from a model, I was able to assess the coverage and measure it that way. And it didn't really matter the number of tests we were putting through, because what was important was the coverage. So follow-up question, do you think code coverage for web automation is a good idea? If yes, what tools do you suggest for doing that? So I think code coverage is really important, but it doesn't really tell you anything except we have exercised this code. I think it's very important when I'm coding and I'm actually building the system and I'm doing test-driven development. I use whatever code coverage tool comes with the IDE, and I can see what code I haven't exercised in my TDD, and I can make decisions about do I want to do that or not. And it's purely at code level. And it's pretty much whatever tool works for that language that is easy to fit into the build process that you've got, or preferably whatever tool the programmers are using, because then they can support you. The tool is almost less important because you just want whatever runs, whatever's easy. When you start moving it up into a technology level like web applications, it's less of a code coverage issue and again a model coverage issue in terms of endpoints. One of the things that can be hard with code coverage for web apps is the JavaScript that's in the web app. If that's not covered by unit tests, it's very hard to measure, because really you only get good code coverage from the unit tests. You don't tend to get code coverage when you're using the application. In order to do that, you have to instrument the code, and then you have to have the ability to report it out somewhere else. In theory, you could do that, but I haven't done that. I rely on code coverage during automated unit testing in order to cover this. So I thought this was an interesting question. In fact, I thought all the questions that we got here were interesting, and I had to think, and it was really good. But this is a kind of pet peeve of mine. So the question was, interview questions in terms of complexity or solutions in terms of approach and algorithms for coding for software development engineers and test and software development engineers. Can they be the same? Do we have the same interview process for both those groups? And the answer is recruitment is broken. The way that we recruit developers and software development engineers and testers is garbage. Any algorithm-based interviews and tests are flawed. They're poor. Unless your company is in the business of selling libraries that implement algorithms, we shouldn't use that as part of our interview process, because everyone looks it up on Google or finds it in a book. What we want to do is audition people, and they're not the same. Right? A software development engineer and test does not do the same thing as a software development engineer. They build different things. One of them is building the application. If you build the application the same way that you build the test code, your application will probably be too slow. There will be too many layers of indirection. If you build your automated execution code the same way you build your application, you won't have enough layers of indirection. It'll probably be too depth. I mean, you see this from the automated execution code that, keep hitting the microphone, see this from the automated execution code that software developers write. It's copy and paste, there's no abstractions, because they're used to writing unit tests that they don't have to maintain as much. Whereas any external facing test has to be maintained and has to have abstraction layers, because we change flows and we change the application. So they are different, we should use different tests, but I try and recruit by an audition process rather than a question process. So I'll sit down with someone. If I'm recruiting someone who I know that a lot of their role has to be automating, I'll sit down with them and say, here is some code that we use to automate our application. Tell me what's good about it. Tell me what's bad. Tell me what you would change. What would you do differently? Okay, let's run this code and let's change it to cover this. How will we do that? What will we expand? And then as they are doing it, I'll get to see what are the limits in their knowledge. Are they fluid with this, right? Is it something that they obviously do a lot, or are they a bit rusty? I can ask them questions about what their thought process was. Why did they choose to do it that way? How have they done this in the past? You seem a bit rusty. Have you not done this for a while? Do you still remember? What were you last using? And it's a very custom process for that individual to get as much information back as possible. And it works for them because they get to see how you do stuff, right? Because an interview process is a two-way thing, right? You're interviewing them to see if they're appropriate, but they're interviewing you to see if they want to work for you. Are you creating the right kind of code they want to work with? Are you building it in the way that they want? That audition process is really, really important. So simulating the environment that they're going to work in is essential. And consequently, software development engineers and test work in a very different way in a different environment than software development engineers. So you need a different process for doing that. I think this is the last question that came through, which is good because we're almost out of time in terms of an hour. If anyone wants to add more questions in the comments, then we can keep going, but otherwise we'll stop fairly soon. So the question was, an application with zero automation, what type of tests do we build first? Smoke tests, end-to-end tests, or regression tests? And the answer is, if I was in that situation, I wouldn't be using those concepts. Now, the interesting thing for me, and I just want to stress this, is when I'm saying I wouldn't use these concepts, or I wouldn't explain it in that way, or I don't use those words, it doesn't mean you're thinking about this wrong, your question's wrong. It means I think about this from a different perspective. I have to answer this question from a different perspective. Because smoke tests, end-to-end tests, regression tests are kind of variants of a theme. A smoke test is essentially could be a subset of the regression test. End-to-end tests are probably part of the concept of regression tests. So again, they're a subset. What we've got is we have to think instead in terms of capabilities, aims, and constraints. All right, so capabilities. Before we do any automated execution, we have to build the capability for doing the automated execution. We have to find the right library. We have to find the right tool. We have to decide what programming language we're going to look at. We have to decide, are we going to try and automate things that are easy, or things that are hard, or things that we do a lot of, or things that we don't do a lot of, but when we do it, we make mistakes, right? What is the aims of what we've got? And some paths through the system have prerequisites that we have to automate regardless. So we have to be able to log in or start a session. So no matter what approach we do, we have to automate those. We have to have the capability for automating it in the first place. Then we also think about what are our aims? What are we trying to achieve? Now, some people would say, why are we automating? Right? Because I don't often use why questions, I have to say, what are we trying to achieve? If I say, why are we automating, then it could be because everyone is automating. Because if I don't automate, then my career goes down the pan because I won't have any skills to build up. But what are we trying to achieve focuses our attention on, if we put all the effort into this, will we gain what we want out of it? Is it worth us doing this? We also have to consider, are we doing it tactically or strategically? Right, a spoke test might be a tactical thing, right? In terms of, I just want to know whether the application's up. I can use a tool to do that. It's a tactical approach. If smoke test is a subset of regression, then it's a strategic thing where we've got the regression test. But that concept of tactical or strategic helps me think different. When do we have to achieve this by, right? Have we got deadlines that we have to do this? Are we doing it for ourselves because we want to improve, or the project's going live at this point? Therefore, in order for us to actually make a difference, we have to automate here because we then have to ramp up at this point. Can we achieve it by this deadline? Do we have enough funding to build up what we need by this point? Are there any quick wins? What is the minimum that we can do to meet these aims? Once we know what the aims are, we can then look at options for doing it. So it's not about smoke or end-to-end regression. It's what are we trying to automate? What information are we trying to get back? What's the return we're trying to get? And then we have to look at our constraints in terms of time, budget, skill sets. And then it's experimenting around that. Because words like smoke, end-to-end regression are strategic words. But the experiments, and we can add a lot of value by doing experiments, by approaching it tactically and just getting something that actually works. So capabilities, aims, constraints, and that split between tactic and strategic is more how I approach that. So if I was approaching with zero automation, I'd be looking at, well, if we're trying to release this very often, where do we spend all our time when we are trying to do that, and what parts of this are easy for us to automate given our current skill sets? And if when we try and do this tactically it fails, are we prepared to put in the effort to make it work? If we're not, then maybe I won't automate it at all. Maybe we'll just keep doing this manually. Can we bring in the development team? Can we make this pain that someone else feels so that they will collaborate on this so that we have more time? Because chances are our time is already consumed with all this testing. And if we have to automate as well, we now have to do all this stuff in the same amount of time. So something's going to have to give. So can we pull other people in? It's that thought process more than the actual concepts. So I think that was all the questions, which was good. I'm looking through the comments in Facebook now to see if I missed any questions. I don't think I did. So if you want to squeeze in a question, this is a good time. Otherwise, I will be stopping because we did it for over an hour now. I think it's just over an hour. I thank you for your time and attention. Hopefully the recording will be there so we can watch that later. And if I talked too fast at certain points, you can go back later on and then understand it. And if you do have any questions, then I might see them if you tag me on them in the Test Drive group. Or you can ask me them through my contact form or on Twitter or anything like that. I'm just pausing to see more questions, but I can't see any. So I think we're done. And I'm watching the feed come through from the buffered part to catch up with what I'm saying. So I'm going to say thank you very much and goodbye. And I will end the live stream there. I'm just kind of making it look like I'm frozen. I'm not really, but I am going to hang up now. So thanks for your time. I really appreciate it. Thanks very much. I'll see you later.